Part 6 of the works of Sallust. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Works of Gaius Sallustius Crispus, translated by Alfred W. Pollard. Catiline Conspiracy, Part 4. It was at this crisis that the empire of the Roman people, in my opinion, reached its most pitiable condition. From the setting of the rising sun its arms had subdued every land to obedience. At home there was peace and wealth, the first of blessings as men esteem them, in abundance. And yet there were found citizens with minds hardened, to undertake their own and their country's destruction. 2 decrees of the Senate had been passed, but of all that host not one was enticed by the reward offered to betray the conspiracy, not one deserted the camp of Catiline. So virulent was the disease which had settled like a plague on the minds of many citizens. Nor was disloyalty confined to those who had been admitted to the conspiracy. It may be said that the whole of the common people, in their eagerness for revolution, approved the designs of Catiline. And this seemed but natural, for it always happens in states that the penniless envy the respectable and praise the disaffected, hate the old order and long for the new, and in their disgust at their own fortunes are eager for a general change. Careless of everything, they find in riot and sedition their meat and drink, for it is easy for the poor to escape loss. The populace of the capital, however, was especially impetuous, and that for many reasons. In the first place, Rome had become a sink into which there poured all who were in any place notorious for crime or vice, others who had shamefully squandered their estates, and, in fine, everyone whose disgraceful conduct and actions had made him an exile from his home. Again, there were many whose thoughts dwelled on the triumph of Sulla. They saw some who had been common soldiers, now senators, and others so rich as to live in the style of regal magnificence. Each hoped that, should he take up arms, victory would bring him no less rewards. Besides these, many young men who had starved in the country on the wages of their hands had been attracted to Rome by public or private bounties, and had learnt to prefer the ease of the capital to such thankless toil. These, and all like them, found their profit in disaster to the state, so that we need wonder the less that penniless men of bad character were filled with high hopes, and measured their country's interest by their own. Again, all those whose parents had been proscribed during Sulla's triumph, whose property had been confiscated, and their political rights impaired, were awaiting the issue of the struggle with like feelings. To these might be added all who, as being in opposition to the senatorial party, preferred a convulsion in the state to their own exclusion from power. In fine, after many years, just the old orders had returned to threaten the state. The tribunatal power had been restored in the consulship of Pompey and Crassus, and henceforth young men, made headstrong by their age and character, possessed themselves of this important office and began to rouse the mob by attacks on the Senate, next by bribery and promises to kindle their passions, and thus, finally, to attain to distinction and influence. They were strenuously opposed by many of the nobility, who made the defense of the Senate a pretext for advancing their own importance. To put the truth shortly, from the time of Sulla forward, though those who busied themselves with state affairs might allege honorable excuses, in some cases the defense of the people's rights, in others the extension of the authority of the Senate, beneath all this pretext of the public good, each was secretly striving to gain power for himself. They showed no moderation, pushed hostility to an extreme, and made a bloody use of victory when won. After the dispatch of Pompey to conduct the wars against the pirates and Mithridates, the power of the commons was broken, and the influence of the oligarchy increased. They held the magistracies, the provincial appointments, and all other patronage, in their own hands. They passed their days in prosperity, free from trouble and anxiety, and by their control of the courts terrified all who while in office treated the populace with greater mildness. As soon, however, as, amid their perilous condition, a hope of revolution was offered to the commons, the old battle cry raised their spirits. Had Catiline come off victor, or even on equal terms, from the first battlefield, the state would no doubt have been prostrated by massacre and disaster, while the victorious party would only have enjoyed their success till some stronger champion snatched power and freedom from their tired and enfeebled hands. Even as it was, many persons not connected with the conspiracy at the outbreak of the war set out to join Catiline. Among these was a certain Aulus Fulvius, a senator's son, who was dragged back when already on the way, and put to death by his father's orders. At Rome, meanwhile, Lentulus was following out the injunction of Catiline, and tampering in person, or through his agents, with all whose character or fortunes made them, he thought, fit instruments of revolution, not confining himself to citizens, but enlisting men of every class, so long as they would be useful in war. In pursuance of this policy, he entrusted a certain Publius Umbrenus with the task of seeking out the ambassadors from the Allobroges, and inducing them, if possible, to join in the war. Their great public and private indebtedness, and the warlike temperament of the Gallic people, led him to hope that they would readily join in such an enterprise. Umbrenus had previously been employed in Gaul, and was acquainted with many of the chief men in the different states. He went to work therefore at once, and on the first occasion of his seeing the ambassadors in the forum, asked a few questions as to their public affairs, and, as if grieved for their misfortunes, began to inquire what issue they hoped for to such evils. They complained of the greed of the magistrates, accused the Senate for its failure to help them, and foreboded death as the one cure for their ills. On hearing this, he told them that if they would be men, he would show them a way of escape from the great evils they spoke of. Inspired with extravagant hopes by his words, the Allobroges implored Umbrenus to take pity on them. There was no task so hard or repellent that they would not be most eager to perform it, if it would but free their state from debt. Thereupon Umbrenus took them to the house of Decimus Brutus, which was near the forum, and was thrown open to the conspirators by the influence of Sempronia, for Brutus at the time was absent from Rome. To lend greater weight to his words, he also summoned Gabinius, and in his presence disclosed the conspiracy, and named his accomplices, including among them, in order to inspire the ambassadors with greater courage, many persons of every rank who were perfectly innocent. At last he procured from the ambassadors a promise of their services, and dismissed them home. The Allobroges, however, wavered for a long time as to what course they should adopt. On the one side was their debt, their love of war, and the great rewards they might expect if victorious. On the other, greater resources, an absence of risk, and a certain and immediate reward instead of uncertain hope. Thus they examined both sides of the question. But the fortune of the Republic at last prevailed. They betrayed the whole affair, as they had heard it, to Quintus Fabius Sanga, whose patronage their state mostly employed. Cicero, informed by Sanga of the plot, instructed the ambassadors to make a great show of zeal for the conspiracy, to visit the rest of the intriguers, make them ample promises, and use every exertion for their complete exposure. Almost simultaneously, there were risings in hither and farther Gaul, as also in Picenum, Bruttium, and Apulia. The agents whom Catiline had previously dispatched on every side were, with a rashness that approached insanity, pushing on all their plans at once. Their midnight councils, their transport of arms and weapons, their general hurry and bustle had caused more fear than actual danger. Many of these agents had been brought to trial by the praetor, Quintus Metellus Celer, in accordance with a resolution of the Senate, and by him thrown into prison. And Gaius Murena had pursued the same course in farther Gaul, where he held command as a legate. Meanwhile, at Rome, Lentulus, with the other heads of the conspiracy, had equipped what seemed to them a large force, and determined that, on the arrival of Catiline and his army at Faesulae, Lucius Bestia, a tribune of the commons, should hold a public meeting, complain of the steps taken by Cicero, and throw the odium of having caused a most terrible war on that excellent consul. Taking this as their signal, the rank and file of their supporters were on the following night to carry out their respective tasks. Report said that these were distributed in the following manner. Statilius and Gabinius, with a large force, were to set fire simultaneously to 12 suitable points in the town. The confusion thus caused would gain them easier access to the consul, and to the others at whom they aimed. Cethegus was to beset Cicero's door and attack him by force. Others of the conspirators had other victims, and the young men, most of them of noble birth, were to murder their parents, and in the general panic that the simultaneous massacre and fire would occasion, a sally was to be made to join Catiline. While these preparations and arrangements were being made, Cethegus was continually complaining of the cowardice of his associates. He declared by their hesitation and delay they had wasted splendid chances. In such a crisis it was action that was needed, not deliberation, and he himself, he protested, were he joined by only a few others, would attack the Senate house, while the rest played the coward. Naturally bold and impetuous, he was ever ready to strike a blow, and was convinced that prompt action offered the highest advantages. To return to the Allobroges, in obedience to Cicero's injunction, they procured a meeting through Gabinius with the rest of the conspirators, and demanded from Lentulus, Cethegus, Statilius, and also Cassius, an oath which they might bear, duly attested, to their countrymen. Without this it would be a difficult task to make them join in so serious an attempt. The rest did as they were asked without any suspicion, but Cassius promised to go shortly to Gaul in person, and, indeed, left the city on that journey some little time before the ambassadors. On the departure of the latter, Lentulus sent with them a certain Titus Volturcius of Crotona, so that previous to their return home they might strengthen the bonds of their alliance by exchanging assurances with Catiline. He further entrusted Volturcius with a letter to Catiline, of which I give a copy. Who I am you will learn from the bearer. Consider the danger of your position, and remember that you are a brave man. Think what your plans demand. Seek help from all, even from the lowest. Besides this letter he sent a verbal message asking, now that he had been declared a public enemy by the Senate, what had he to gain by refusing the help of slaves? The preparation he had ordered in the capital had been made. There must be no delay on his part in advancing nearer to Rome. When matters had gone thus far, on the night agreed on for their departure, Cicero, whose emissaries had informed him of everything, gave orders to the praetors, Lucius Valerius Flaccus and Gaius Pomptinus, to plant an ambush by the Mulvian bridge and seize the Allobroges with their retinue. He explained clearly the object of which they were sent, and empowered them to manage the details as need might arise. The praetors, men used to war, quietly stationed their guards and secretly occupied the bridge, according to their instructions. The ambassadors, with Volturcius, had no sooner arrived at the place than a simultaneous shout arose from either side. The Gauls quickly recognized the design, and promptly surrendered to the praetors. Volturcius at first encouraged the rest to resistance, and defended himself with his sword against his numerous assailants. Finding, however, that he was deserted by the ambassadors, after many entreaties to Pomptinus on the score of their acquaintance to secure his safety, he at last, in great fear and trembling for his life, surrendered to the praetors as though to declared enemies. On the successful execution of the design a full account was quickly conveyed to the consul, whose mind was filled at once with anxiety and rejoicing, with joy at the news that by the disclosure of the plot, the state was saved from its danger, but with deep anxiety, in his hesitation as to what must be done with citizens of such rank detected in so great a crime. To punish them, he thought, would bring trouble on himself, while to allow them to escape might ruin the state. Summoning all his resolution, he ordered Lentulus, Cethegus, Statilius, and Gabinius to be called before him, and with them a certain Caeparius of Terracina, who was preparing to set out for Apulia, there to rouse the slaves. The rest appeared without delay. Caeparius, who had left his house a little before, had learnt the discovery of the plot, and escaped from the city. Lentulus, as praetor, the consul himself conducted, holding him by the hand. The rest, under guard, he ordered to come to the temple of Concord. Thither he had summoned the Senate, and in a crowded assembly of its members he now introduced Volturcius with the ambassadors, while he ordered the praetor Flaccus to bring the dispatch box, with the letters which he had received from the ambassadors. Volturcius was then examined on the subject of his journey, the letter, and finally as to his purpose and motive. At first he made pretenses, and tried to conceal all knowledge of the conspiracy. Afterwards, when bidden to speak with a guarantee from the state of his safety, he betrayed everything just as it had taken place, and informed the Senate that, as he himself had only been admitted to the conspiracy by Gabinius and Caeparius a few days before, he knew no more than the ambassadors. He could only say that he had been used to hear from Gabinius that Publius Autronius, Servius Sulla, Lucius Varguntius, and many others were among its members. The confession of the Gauls was to the same effect, and when Lentulus pretended ignorance, they convicted him not only by the letter, but by the words he had often used. The Sibyllary books, he had said, prophesied that 3 Cornelii should rule Rome. Cinna and Sulla had already done so, and he himself was the third to whom fate assigned the government of the city. Moreover, this was the 12th year from that in which the Capitol had been burnt, and augurs had frequently declared on the strength of prodigies that it should be rendered bloody by a civil war. All the prisoners had previously acknowledged their seals, and accordingly, after the letters had been read, the Senate made a decree that Lentulus, on laying down his office, as well as the rest, should be kept in free or private custody. Accordingly, they were delivered to the following guardians: Lentulus to Publius Lentulus Spinther, at that time an aedile; Cethegus to Quintus Cornificus; Statilius to Gaius Caesar; Gabinius to Marcus Crassus; and Caeparius, who had been pursued and just brought back, to a senator named Gnaeus Terentius. Meanwhile the commons, who, at first, in their eagerness for a revolution, were too favorable to the idea of war, now that the nature of the conspiracy was laid bare, experienced a revulsion of feeling. They cursed the designs of Catiline, exalted Cicero to heaven, and were as full of joy and gladness as though they had escaped from slavery. Any other outrage of war would rather have given them plunder than have done them harm, but a conflagration, they thought, a ruthless and extravagant measure, and one fraught with misery to themselves, whose whole wealth consisted in articles of daily use and personal clothing. On the following day there was brought before the Senate a certain Lucius Tarquinius, who was said to have been pursued and captured on his way to join Catiline. He offered, if granted a public guarantee, to give information about the plot, and was ordered by the consul to make a full confession of all he knew. He told the Senate a tale very similar to that of Volturcius, about preparations for firing the city, a massacre of the respectable classes, and the approach of the enemy, but added that he himself had been sent by Marcus Crassus with a message to Catiline, not to let the seizure of Lentulus, Cethegus, and the other conspirators alarm him, but to make it an additional reason for a rapid advance on Rome, by which the spirits of the rest would be revived and the prisoners more easily rescued from danger. On the mention, however, of Crassus, a man of birth, of enormous wealth, and the very greatest influence, some thought the story unworthy of belief, others again deemed it true, yet were of the opinion that at such a crisis a man of his importance should rather be conciliated than provoked. And as most of the senators were, in their private affairs, at the mercy of Crassus, all united in a cry that the witness was no honest one, and demanded that a motion should be made on the subject. On the motion therefore of Cicero, and in a crowded house, the Senate resolved that, whereas the witness of Tarquinius appears dishonest, he is to be kept in custody, and to be granted no further privilege of audience, until such time as he confess at whose instigation he fabricated so grievous a charge. It was thought at the time by some that the information was contrived by Publius Artronius, in order that Crassus by the accusation might be made to share the peril of the rest, and these then gain the protection of his power. Others asserted that Tarquinius was set on by Cicero to prevent Crassus, according to his wont, taking the sedition under his patronage, and so embroiling the state. At a later period I personally heard Crassus declare that Cicero had actually put this insult upon him. At the same conjuncture Quintus Catulus and Gaius Piso failed, either by bribery or influence, to induce Cicero to have Gaius Caesar dishonestly accused by means of the Allobroges or some other informer. Both these nobles were at bitter enmity with Caesar. Piso he had assailed when on his trial for malversation, on the score of having unjustly punished a certain Transpatane. Catulus hated him on account of their contest for the pontificate, in that, at the close of his life and after filling the highest offices, he had been beaten by such a mere youth as Caesar. The state of the latter's affairs also favored the accusation, as his extraordinary profusion and the splendor of his public entertainments had sunk him heavily in debt. Unable to induce the consul to commit such a crime, they applied themselves to individual intrigues, and, by coining falsehoods, which they declared they had heard from Volturcius or the Allobroges, raised much odium against Caesar. So successful indeed were they, that some Roman knights, who were on guard under arms round the Temple of Concord, were carried away either by the greatness of the danger or their own excitable character, and, on Caesar's leaving the Senate, threatened him with their swords, in order to show their zeal for the constitution. End of Catiline Conspiracy, Part 4.